on our first keynote of this morning with Terence Jeyaretnam, partner and APAC leader climate change and sustainability services at EY. Terence, good morning. How are you?
Hi, Neil. Great. How are you?
Yes, really good. Thank you. You have the honour of kicking things off to you. The virtual floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil, and thanks for the opportunity to present. I'm going to talk about a little less talked about a subject in sustainability. We talk a lot about climate and biodiversity and the environment, but inequality is a little bit. But I believe we're going to talk more and more about inequality in the coming years. So it's my pleasure to come in and talk a little bit about it and introduce this subject, but also talk about how this is linked to business performance. So this is called the Mercator map of the world, which is essentially showing you the map of the world, but it shows you the actual size of the countries, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So the map was sort of laid out and drawn originally in the way that the globe would unfold. But if you look at the actual size of the countries, they shrink because they are really not that size. So when Donald Trump talked about buying Greenland, he's talking about buying a much smaller country on the top right, the left of the screen. And I'm showing you this because not everything that we see in the world is what it is. We hear things and we see things that are within our context, but it may not necessarily be what the actual story is or the reality is. And it's quite relevant when it comes to discussing inequality as an issue. So we are all born in the human species, and depending on where we are born and what time period we were born in, we may be experiencing a good life or a not so great life. And so people go through life with different inequalities, and every person who's watching may have experienced some level of inequality in their life. So it's important to know that, again, going back to the first slide, you might see the world in your particular view, but that might not be the world for someone else. Inequality and income and wealth distribution are all part of measuring national performance and global performance and GDP. So we hear these acronyms and sort of ways of describing things all the time, but we might not necessarily understand them from an inequality point of view. So the two measurements for inequality are called the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve. So these are measurements that have been well understood and used to measure inequality, particularly at a national level when you're comparing one country to another country. So when you've got the straight line between national income and the percentage of population, the straight line right through the middle basically is when you've got a very equal society. So if you draw a line at the 50% percentage of population, 50% of people are earning 50% of the national income. But that's not often the case, and particularly in countries such as Singapore, Australia, the US, the UK, there are a very small percentage of people earning a larger share of national income. And so the Lorenz curve measures the proportion of income that people are making. So, for example, if you look at the blue line, 10% of the population, say at the bottom, might be earning a much larger percentage of the national income. So how do we bring that back into sustainability? So back about 20 years ago, a chap called Mathis Wackernagle came up with what we call now the Earth Overshoot Day. So the Earth Overshoot Day is when which day of the year that as a planet we have exhausted what we were meant to consume. So if you treat the planet as something that provides for people to live in, i.e., you can take and you can create waste, and if the overshoot day is December 31, so that means that there's no overshoot. You've basically lived off the capital that the Earth provides. Lived off the interest that the Earth provides, not the capital. Whereas the notion of the Earth overshoot day is that we've overshot the capital and we're starting to use up the capital. So the overshoot day for last year was August the 2nd. So everything after the August 2nd, we were depleting our capital. And if we look across the world and the countries that are on the map, the overshoot day it varies. So the best one is Jamaica in the middle of December. Australia, for example, where I'm from, is March the 23rd. Qatar is the worst performer at 10th of Feb, and everyone in between. And so this is the world map of when countries are overshooting what they're provided with and depleting their capital from a resources and Earth systems point of view. And that relates to inequality, because the more you're taking out, someone in that country or in another country is paying for. And someone intergenerationally is also paying for. So this is how the overshoot day links back to inequality. That's Australia, that's the UK. If we then look at, okay, well, what are the systems that we're depleting and what started happening around these timelines? So you'll see a dotted line in these graphs, which is the 1950. And right after World War II, there was a lot of investment in industry, and the world grew significantly from World War II onwards. So 1950 onwards is what we call the Great Acceleration. On the left-hand side, you've got indicators of economic growth, whether that's real GDP through to telecom growth, through to paper production. They've all shot the same way. On the right-hand side, you've got the impacts on the planet, i.e., what are the different ecological impacts or Earth system impacts that we've experienced. And if we start to measure that, you also see a similar acceleration. There are two that have not changed. One is stratospheric ozone, which, as a result of the Montreal Protocol, we managed to reduce the HFCs that are being produced and reduce the size of the ozone hole in the ozone layer. The other one is marine fish capture, and that's because the fisheries have been depleted and you can't catch any more fish than we're catching now. So that's flatlined. Everything else is still shooting up. Again, I put this up because things like the marine fish capture flatlining is really an impact on people that are dependent on fish as a protein, and again, the more wealthy nations tend to grab more of these resources, leaving less for poorer countries and poorer populations. You would have all heard about Sustainable Development Goals, which got ratified in 2015. There are 4 Sustainable Development Goals out of the 17 that relate to inequality. One is poverty, the other is gender equality, the third is reducing inequalities itself, and the fourth one is peace, justice, and strong institutions, which is kind of a collaborative SDG that's meant to help collaboration between institutions and countries reduce, or to reduce impact and increase sustainable performance. Just some other things that we need to be mindful of. by 2050, there's going to be more plastic by weight than fish. So we talked about the fish indicator, but the other thing that we're doing is creating a lot of waste. And waste impacts on communities, particularly poorer communities. And again, if we go back to communities that depend on fish for protein, they're going to be seeing more plastic than fish by weight by 2050. The other thing that we are all aware of is that the consumption levels have increased. So we tend to see more and more stuff being bought. And if you just look at that illustration of a branch and more things being stacked, we are potentially cracking the branch that we live on, i.e. Pulling from the capital that we have and therefore creating a system that is no longer going to be fit for human survival. There's other things that are happening in the plastic front. Scientists express concern over health impacts, with another study recently finding particles in arteries. And I really love this quote by Tim Jackson, which says, "People are persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't have to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about." 113 million people went to the global consumer class in 2024. So if I go back to the Earth Overshoot Day diagram of showing all the countries, we have all the countries there moving in the wrong direction, but the countries that are not on that map wanting to join that because everyone wants to move to a consumer class. So the problems continue to escalate. If we look at our consumption over the 20th century, it's equal to what we consumed in the last 6 years. Just to give you a sense of how consumption has skyrocketed, and going back to those overshoot acceleration graphs, how we've accelerated production and consumption over the last 70 years, but especially over the last decade. So we talk about inequality. I mentioned intergenerational inequality. There's a range of issues that are contributing to intergenerational inequality, but in particular, and I'll list some of these, but in particular, planetary impacts and impacts on societies as a result will have intergenerational inequalities, not just from the point of view of having the same amount of resources to draw from, but also things like having plastic in the placenta from which you're born. If we go back to the original picture of you being born, that wasn't there a generation ago. And the other issue that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is climate change and its impact on inequality. So I'll put up this map which shows us how climate's warming in the different countries, starting from A in Afghanistan through to Zimbabwe, Z at the bottom right, and how that's moved over the last 100 years. So as you can see, what we will start to see is more orange and more red across the world. And this is from data that we've got from NASA that essentially shows how the planet's warming from human-induced climate change. And this observation is particularly stark in the last 2 decades. It sort of went very quickly to orange and red. So planet's warming a lot quicker. This is US Met data, again showing a very similar story, top left 1851 through to bottom right 2020. But 2023 was a very stark year. Things were completely different in 2023 over other years since 1940. So that overshoot is of concern to scientists globally. We had hotter hots, colder colds, drier dries, and wetter wets, and certainly every country's experienced these. But you would have heard of some of these, EDF cutting nuclear power because of water running low in the rivers, through to the floods in Beijing, through to the wildfires in Hawaii. But you may not, and the Panama Canal, but you may not have heard about 700,000 people being displaced in Somalia in November 2023. That's because we, as I said in the Mercator diagram of the world before, we hear some things, but we're not hearing everything, and our worldview is limited, in terms of where we're located. The other one that you might have not heard about is that the world had a ban on rice due to extreme weather events, particularly out of India. If we look at where that rice is going, it's going into African nations, which would have paid a higher price for rice last year from these export destinations. Most studies are projecting warmer levels of heat in parts of the world, but if you look at some of the countries that are affected, they're through the equator and through Africa mostly, because the northern hemisphere is less impacted, or it gets better with climate change. So again, climate change creates lots of inequalities to people, from sea level rise in low-lying regions through to indigenous people being affected from their sort of environments being overused, food systems being impacted, particularly in areas where most is drawn from a capital point of view. So lots of inequalities created through climate change. The other one that I'd briefly talk about is AI. We've gone from people working on fitting every part of the car through to robots, through to AI. And lots of people around the world are concerned in some way of losing their job, or their skills not being able to continue to contribute to having their job. But this will drive the national income being constrained to a smaller and smaller percentage of high income earners, because those that control the technology will control the wealth. So again, AI will drive more and more concentration of wealth. We also note that income inequality results in greater health and social problems, particularly in the Western world. So Japan is really good compared to other parts of the world. USA on the top right, as income inequality rises, your index of health and social problems grow. Australia sits about the middle. I've talked a little bit about this. The population growth is the other thing to quickly note, which is that population, again, if I mentioned 2050, where the acceleration point is, 1950, you can see how the population's skyrocketed from about 2 billion to 8 billion, and the projected 10 billion. So the world population continues to grow, and with inequalities rising and overshoot continuing, you will see the poorer countries experiencing higher levels of population growth going forward up to 2100, which then means that we're going to see more and more of economic migration and more of the rise of the right wing in terms of closing down the borders. So there'll be political ramifications that use inequality as a way to get into politics. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Task Force on Inequality-Related Financial Disclosures. So just like the Task Force on Climate Change and Task Force on Nature, there's a task force that's been set up to look at how inequality may impact business as usual and how that might impact financial performance. These are the different stakeholders that have brought this together and starting to look at inequality's impact on business. The purpose is to strengthen the development of financial disclosures relating to inequality, and essentially provide the right information to the right stakeholders in order to improve inequality within the value chain of business so that business performance is not dented by inequality. And by default, inequality is reduced by business. So to conclude, I love this quote: having heard all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say you did not know. William Wilberforce. You've heard a number of things today. Hopefully some of that sticks with you, and you can change some of the things that you're doing personally and help some of the things that your organization is doing from a sustainability and inequality point of view. I write a monthly blog on LinkedIn. So if you look me up, there's only one Terence Jeyaretnam, I think, on LinkedIn. So if you do link me in, you'll come up with a monthly blog that essentially looks at the top 10 markers globally that happened every month. So I'll put that up at the end of every month. So please feel free to link in with me. And with that, I'll throw back to Neil.
Thank you very much indeed. That is without question the most profound opening to an event we've ever had, and certainly the first person who has ever quoted William Wilberforce in a presentation that I've been at one of these events. So breaking new ground already, which is always a good start. A couple of questions, if I may, before we let you get on with your day. I guess the first question people will be asking after watching all of that, you can't help but be affected by watching a lot of those parts of the presentation, is what can people do individually and within their own businesses to try and make an impact on that?
Absolutely, and a great question. I think there's lots of government policy and institutional sort of momentum around climate and biodiversity and plastics and so on. But I personally believe that the work has to be both ways. It needs to be from institutions and governments and the UN and globally, but also individual responsibility needs to be a big part of that. So my sort of suggestion is very simple. Look at your entire value chain as a person or as an organization, and look at where you can make your impact. The most amount of impact sometimes is in the least considered areas. For example, where you might be putting your money, the bank or the investment fund, you could be making the most amount of impact in terms of choosing a socially responsible fund or a socially responsible bank to put your money with. So who you trade with, what you buy, the brands that you support, and so on and so forth. The consumer end of your life sometimes can be more impactful than looking at an electric car versus a fossil fuel car. But I consider everything from what you drive, what you eat, what you do, what you use and what you consume needs to be looked at in order to best create a personal impact through your family, through your community, and through to the companies that you work for.
Because the sustainability agenda within business is growing exponentially. I know I read more sustainability policies and strategies than is probably healthy for one man, but the inequality area of that, it doesn't get the same attention. Do you feel that's going to be a particular growth area? Because the two aspects are so, as you've just gone through in great detail, inextricably linked.
Absolutely, Neil. I think it will. So one trend globally from 1950 again is that inequality has grown. Inequality used to be an issue back in the days of Vikings and kingdoms, but it got better and better, and then it got to a point of quite good equality up to about the Second World War, and since then, it's become worse. And the Task Force for Inequality-Related Financial Disclosures is focusing on how inequality is going to impact business from a systemic way, a bit like the global financial crisis, or how climate change is impacting business. So I think from a business point of view, we're going to see more and more discussion on inequality. We're also probably going to see it from a political point of view. We talked about the rise of the right wing and people using immigration as an issue. And I think we're also going to see it from a institutional point of view, whether it's religious institutions or educational institutions, we're going to start more and more seeing discussions around how inequality is getting worse and how some of the planetary conditions are making it even worse than what it was.
Okay, Terence, it's been a fantastic way to start the show today. I urge everyone to follow that blog on LinkedIn as well monthly. That's well worth a read. Terence, thanks so much for joining us here at Sustainability Live Singapore.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed.